You step outside and the cold hits you first, not a chill, a wall. Your breath freezes the instant it leaves your mouth. For roughly 100,000 years, this wasn't weather. This was simply where you lived. No heating, no insulated walls, no down jacket waiting by the door. Just you, a fire that might go out, and a winter that lasted most of the year. So how did anyone survive this? And why does the answer involve sewing needles, not just strength? You probably picture Ice Age humans as brutes. Thick-skinned, hardened, somehow biologically built for the cold in a way you aren't. That picture is mostly wrong, and the real story is far more interesting. Your ancestors were not invincible against the cold. They were vulnerable, soft-skinned mammals just like you, dropped into one of the harshest climates this planet has produced. What saved them wasn't toughness. It was technology, planning, and an almost obsessive attention to detail that modern survival shows rarely give credit for. Let's set the scene properly. The last glacial maximum, the coldest stretch of the most recent ice age, peaked between roughly 26,500 and 19,000 years ago. Decode that for a second. An ice age isn't one cold day repeated forever. It's a sustained climate state, where ice sheets pile up over entire continents, and temperatures across Europe and northern Asia sit consistently far below anything you've likely experienced. Sea levels dropped by about 125 meters, low enough to expose land bridges that don't exist today, because so much of the planet's water was locked into solid ice instead of liquid ocean. You wake up in this world, cold ground beneath you, a fire that needs constant feeding or it dies, and if it dies at night, you might not wake up at all. Here's a number worth sitting with before going any further. Some hominin populations endured cold European winters for hundreds of thousands of years, stretching across multiple distinct glacial periods. Not just one bad stretch of weather, but recurring cycles of brutal cold, separated by warmer interludes, over and over, for far longer than written history has existed. Modern humans arriving into this landscape were stepping into a climate that had already been tested again and again against earlier hominins who came before them. Some of those earlier populations made it through multiple ice ages. Others, in certain regions, did not. The cold was not a single obstacle to clear. It was a recurring exam that the planet kept giving, generation after generation, with no guarantee of a passing grade. So what's the first thing you'd actually need? Not bravery, not muscle, clothing. Real clothing, not just animal skin draped over your shoulders like a blanket. This is where the story gets surprising. Researcher Trenton Holliday, who studies how Neanderthals adapted to cold climates, has argued that survival in glacial Europe depended on a combination of three things working together. Technological responses, like clothing and shelter, anatomical responses, like body shape and proportions, and physiological responses, the body's internal ability to generate and conserve heat. No single one of these was enough on its own. You needed all three, layered on top of each other, the same way you'd layer clothing itself. Let's start with the anatomy, because your body actually changes shape over generations in response to extreme cold, and the evidence for this is written directly into ancient skeletons. Populations adapted to colder climates tend to develop shorter limbs and stockier builds relative to their height. Decode that. A shorter arm or leg has less surface area exposed to the air relative to its volume, which means less heat escapes from it. It's the same principle behind why your fingers and toes get cold faster than your torso. More surface, more heat loss. Ice Age humans living in the coldest regions show this pattern clearly in their bone proportions. A slow, multi-generational adjustment to a climate that simply never let up. But anatomy alone wouldn't get you through a single winter night. You needed your body's internal furnace too. When your skin gets cold, blood vessels near the surface constrict, pulling blood away from your extremities and toward your core. This protects your vital organs, your heart, your lungs, the parts of you that absolutely cannot stop working, at the direct expense of your fingers and toes. It's why your hands go numb in the cold, long before your chest does. Your body is making a calculated trade, sacrificing dexterity to protect survival. There's also a stranger mechanism at play, one your body still performs today without you noticing. After several minutes of intense cold exposure, your blood vessels periodically and briefly dilate again, sending a rush of warm blood back into your fingers before constricting once more. Researchers call this the hunter's response, because it likely evolved specifically to let people keep working with their hands in freezing conditions, just long enough to tie a knot, strike a spark, or grip a spear before the cold closes back in. None of this, the shortened limbs, the vasoconstriction, the brief returning rush of warmth, was a conscious choice. It was evolution quietly stacking the deck in your ancestors' favor over tens of thousands of years. But evolution is slow, and an ice age moves fast compared to genetic change. So the real survival story isn't really about biology at all. It's about what your ancestors built. There's a deeper layer to this story too, one that pushes back against the simplest version of the tough caveman myth. For decades, many researchers assumed that earlier human relatives, like Neanderthals, survived primarily through raw physical resilience, thick bodies built to absorb cold the way a boulder absorbs a storm. More recent analysis complicates that picture. Neanderthals likely combined the same three strategies modern humans did: a body shape adapted over generations, an internal physiology tuned to conserve heat, and crucially, technology, clothing, fire, shelter. The idea that biology alone could carry any hominin species through 100,000 years of glacial winters has mostly given way to a more accurate, more interesting picture. Even the toughest-looking ancient humans needed tools, not just toughness. Think about what that means for you specifically. If a species often imagined as practically built for the cold still needed external technology to survive it, then your own ancestors, the more anatomically similar to you version of early modern humans, needed it even more. The cold didn't care how strong you were, it cared whether you had something covering your skin that actually worked. So let's reconstruct a day, not the cinematic version with growling saber-toothed cats around every corner, the real version, where the danger is quieter and far more relentless. You wake before dawn, because the fire needs attention immediately or it will be gone by the time the sun rises. Someone in your group has likely been awake half the night already, tending it in shifts, because letting it die isn't really an option. Around you, the shelter isn't a cave most of the time, despite what you might assume. Researchers studying Ice Age sites across the open plains of Europe and Eurasia have found structures built from the materials actually available there. Mammoth bones used as a frame, hides stretched over the top, creating something closer to a tent than a permanent building. Bones because there were almost no trees on this landscape to provide proper wood. You build with what the land gives you, even if what the land gives you is the skeleton of an animal twice your size. The fire itself demands constant labor that never really stops. Someone has to keep walking the perimeter for fuel, scraps of bone, dried dung, whatever will burn in a landscape with almost no standing timber. Cooking happens here too, but so does something easy to overlook: drying out wet clothing from yesterday's hunt, because damp fur against your skin in sub-zero temperatures can be more dangerous than no fur at all. Wet insulation stops insulating. Everyone here understands this instinctively, the same way you instinctively know not to leave a wet jacket on in a snowstorm. Except for them, the margin for error is razor thin, and the nearest backup option doesn't exist. There's maintenance work too, the kind that never makes it into dramatic retellings of prehistoric life, but mattered just as much as the hunt itself. Hide softened the day before, needs checking for cracks before it freezes stiff and useless. A needle, carved painstakingly from bone or ivory, has to be inspected for hairline fractures, because losing your only working needle partway through winter could mean the difference between repaired clothing and clothing that slowly falls apart against your skin. Spare sinew thread gets coiled and stored somewhere dry. None of this is glamorous. All of it is survival. Now think about clothing, because this is where the evidence gets remarkably specific. At a site called Sungir, in what is now Russia, archaeologists excavated burials dating back roughly 30,000 to 34,000 years. The bodies were covered, almost entirely, in small carved beads made from mammoth ivory, thousands of them on a single individual, arranged in careful, deliberate patterns. At first glance, you might assume this is just decoration, jewelry for the afterlife. But researchers studying the exact placement of these beads were able to reconstruct something far more practical. The pattern of the beads traced the outline of fitted clothing, a shirt without a center seam, Pants connected directly to footwear, like a single continuous garment. A hood. This wasn't loose fur thrown over a shoulder. This was tailored clothing, cut and shaped to fit a specific body, sewn together with enough precision that thousands of small beads could be sewn in deliberate rows along the seams. Think about what that actually requires. Someone has to scrape and soften animal hide until it's workable. Someone has to cut that hide into shaped pieces. Not just one big wrap, but a torso piece, sleeve pieces, leg pieces, each one fitted to a particular part of the body. And then someone has to sew all those pieces together, using a needle fine enough to pierce hide without tearing it, and thread strong enough to hold the seams against wind and movement. Consider, too, the sheer time investment this represents. Researchers studying the beadwork at this site have estimated that crafting a single ivory bead, drilling it, smoothing it, shaping it by hand, took roughly an hour of focused labor. Multiply that by the thousands of beads found on just one individual's burial clothing, and you start to understand that staying warm wasn't a quick task squeezed in between other chores. It was a major, ongoing investment of time and skill, likely shared across multiple people, possibly across an entire season of work, all in service of a garment that had to function perfectly the very first time it was worn outside into the cold. That needle is not a small detail either. Archaeologists have recovered eyed sewing needles from Ice Age sites, tools carved with a tiny hole precise enough to thread sinew or plant fiber through. Decode why this matters. A needle with an eye lets you create a locked, tight seam, dramatically more wind-resistant than simply draping skins and tying them with cord. The difference between a draped hide and a sewn, fitted garment is roughly the difference between standing outside in a poncho during a blizzard versus standing outside in a properly sealed winter coat. One of these keeps you alive through the night, the other doesn't. And the choice of material mattered just as much as the stitching. At sites in what is now Germany, researchers analyzed the age and species of animal remains left behind by Ice Age hunters and found something telling. The hunting patterns shifted with the seasons, deliberately targeting reindeer, specifically during the cold months, late autumn into the depths of winter. Decode why. Reindeer fur in winter has a unique structure. Hollow hairs that trap air and insulate far better than summer fur, while also repelling water. Your ancestors weren't randomly killing whatever animal crossed their path. They were timing their hunts around which animal's coat would keep them alive through the season ahead, and waiting for that coat to be at its absolute warmest before taking the kill. This is the counterintuitive twist worth sitting with for a moment. You might assume the people who survived the Ice Age did so through brute physical toughness, gritting their teeth against a cold that would kill you instantly. The truth is closer to the opposite. They survived through planning so meticulous it would put most modern outdoor retailers to shame. Seasonal hunting schedules built around fur quality, tailored sewn clothing engineered for specific body parts, shelters constructed from whatever material the landscape actually provided, mammoth bone instead of timber, because adapting to your environment's specific limitations was the entire point. There's a study that reframes this even further. Researchers comparing ancient human survival strategies to those of wolves and brown bears, the two other major predators sharing the Ice Age landscape, found a striking ecological overlap. Humans appear to have occupied a similar niche to these animals, competing for similar prey and adapting to the same brutal seasonal pressures. The difference wasn't biology. Wolves and bears had fur, body fat, hibernation. Humans had almost none of those built-in advantages. What humans had instead was culture, clothing they invented, shelters they engineered, fire they controlled and carried with them. A species without natural cold adaptations outcompeted and coexisted with animals who had been built for this climate for millions of years, purely through accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next. And that knowledge had to travel between groups, not just within them. Archaeologists studying Ice Age sites have found raw materials, certain stone types, seashells, amber, that originated far from where they were eventually used, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. This tells you something important about how isolated tribes actually were, or rather weren't. Exchange networks connected different groups across the landscape, likely trading not just objects but information. Which valley still had game this season? Which route avoided the deepest snow? Which group had found a better way to seal a seam against the wind? Surviving the Ice Age wasn't just an individual or even a single tribe achievement. It depended on a web of cooperation stretching across vast frozen distances. Archaeologists have also found evidence that different groups sometimes came together seasonally, gathering in larger numbers than usual at certain times of year, likely for both social and practical reasons. Picture what that actually meant. Groups who spent most of the year isolated from each other, spread thin across a frozen landscape, periodically converging to share resources, trade mates, exchange techniques, and simply remind each other that they weren't the only humans left out there. In a world this harsh, that kind of periodic gathering wasn't a luxury. It was likely essential to a small group's long-term survival, a way of refreshing the gene pool, the knowledge pool, and quite possibly morale itself, after months of relative isolation against an unforgiving climate. Picture the night now, because nights were when the real danger sharpened. Your shelter holds in some warmth, but not all of it. Bodies are packed close together, not for comfort exactly, though that mattered too, but because shared body heat in an enclosed space is itself a survival technology, as real and necessary as the clothing on your back. Someone keeps the fire alive in shifts through the dark hours, waking at intervals dictated by nothing but instinct and necessity, because there's no alarm clock to schedule the watch. If you've layered your clothing correctly, sewn tight at the seams, fitted to your specific frame, you might actually sleep through most of it. If you haven't, the cold finds every gap, and a long enough night can quietly become the last one. Children sleep closest to the center of the group, surrounded on every side by adult bodies acting as a living windbreak. This isn't sentimentality, the same way community care during illness wasn't sentimentality. It's a direct, practical response to a measurable fact. Smaller bodies lose heat faster relative to their size. The same surface area principle that shaped your ancestors' limb proportions over generations. Everyone here understands, without needing it explained, who is most vulnerable on a given night, and adjusts their sleeping position accordingly. This is the part of the story that should land somewhere personal. You live surrounded by climate control so total you rarely think about it. A thermostat on the wall. A coat you bought without sewing a single stitch yourself. Heated seats in your car. The temperature of your home is a number you choose, not a daily life or death negotiation with the natural world. Your ancestors solved the exact same problem you face every winter, staying warm, except they solved it with bone needles, animal fur timed to its seasonal peak, and shelters built from the skeletons of mammoths, with absolutely no margin for a mistake. Consider how differently you relate to a single winter coat compared to how your ancestors related to theirs. You can replace a coat in an afternoon, walking into a store and walking out minutes later with something warmer. Theirs took a season to make, sometimes longer, and represented hundreds of hours of collective labor, hunting the right animal at the right time of year, scraping and curing the hide, cutting it into shaped pieces, sewing it tight with a hand-carved needle, decorating it not purely for vanity, but, in some cases, to mark status, identity, or belonging to a particular group. A torn seam wasn't a minor inconvenience you'd fix with a sewing kit from a drawer. It was a genuine emergency, repaired immediately, by firelight if necessary, because the alternative was losing body heat you couldn't afford to lose. There's also something worth noticing about how little choice your ancestors actually had in any of this. You can choose to ignore winter almost entirely if you want to, moving from a heated house to a heated car to a heated office, without ever truly feeling the season pressing against your skin. Your ancestors had no such option. Winter wasn't background weather. It was the dominant force shaping nearly every decision they made for months at a time. When to hunt, what to wear, how close to sleep to one another, how much fuel to gather before dark. An entire society's daily rhythm bent itself completely around a climate that offered no negotiation and no escape. And yet, somehow, they didn't just endure it. They thrived in it long enough to spread across entire continents, buried under ice, raise children inside it, develop art and ornamentation inside it, build trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers inside it. The Ice Age wasn't simply survived in the grim, gritted teeth sense you might imagine. For many of these communities, it appears to have been lived fully, with culture and craft and connection intact, despite a climate actively working against every one of those things. Next time you complain about a cold commute or pull on a jacket without a second thought, consider what that jacket actually represents. Thousands of generations of trial and error, sewn seams refined across countless winters, seasonal timing passed down because someone, somewhere, noticed that reindeer fur in November behaved differently than reindeer fur in July, and made sure their children knew it too. Shared knowledge passed between strangers across frozen plains because survival depended on people who would never meet exchanging what they had learned, bead by bead, stitch by stitch, season after season. You are wearing the end result of an arms race against winter itself, one your ancestors fought, and, against enormous odds, won. You step outside and the cold hits you first. But this time, you're not standing in a wall of ice age wind with nothing but hope and a fire that might die before morning. You're wearing the inheritance of 100,000 winters survived, stitched, one careful seam at a time, by people who refused to let the cold decide how the story ended.